In the quiet shimmer of the Mediterranean night, the wind carried a strange anticipation toward the golden shores of Alexandria. The sea glowed beneath the moon as if revealing a secret path meant for a single traveler. Something in the air felt heavy, yet inviting the kind of tension that appears just before history quietly changes its course. And as Rome's most formidable general approached Egypt's restless kingdom, the world seemed to pause in a breathless hush. Caesar stepped onto Alexandria's harbor with the steady confidence of a man who had crossed continents only to bend them to his will. Behind him, weary Roman soldiers marched in disciplined rows, though a few looked more interested in finding shade than shaping destiny. The warm Egyptian air greeted Caesar like an old acquaintance, yet the atmosphere around the palace crackled with unease. Egypt's throne was wobbly at best, and everyone, including the marble pillars, seemed aware that the situation required more than polite conversation. Awaiting him inside the palace was young King Ptolemy XIII, who announced with great pride that he was 12 years old and therefore absolutely old enough to rule. Caesar studied the boy with mild curiosity, wondering how a child barely tall enough to reach the armrest of his own throne was expected to manage a kingdom that could barely manage its own granaries. Still, Ptolemy lifted his chin, determined to appear regal, while his regent and prime minister stood stiffly beside him, hoping Caesar would overlook the chaos swirling just beneath the surface. The ministers explained that Egypt had unfortunately reached a point where paying its debt to Rome was difficult. Caesar offered a courteous nod, masking the sharper thought that Rome did not travel across the sea merely to be told no. When he asked about Cleopatra, the name caused a visible ripple through the room. They claimed she had fled the country, offering that explanation in the hesitant tone of people who desperately hoped Caesar would not examine it too closely. Caesar observed the political situation unfolding like a tapestry full of loose threads. Sibling rivalries were tearing the royal family apart. Grain supplies were disappearing in patterns that suggested mismanagement or corruption, or both. The people were hungry, the treasury nearly empty. The army positioned in a way that suggested it might be guarding against threats, both inside and outside the palace. Nothing was stable, yet everyone insisted things were under control, which only convinced Caesar further that nothing was under control. Reports from his officers confirmed that Ptolemy's forces vastly outnumbered Caesar's own troops. If they turned hostile, the Romans could be overwhelmed within hours. The thought did not alarm Caesar so much as irritate him. He had come to settle a debt and perhaps enjoy a bit of Egyptian hospitality, not to babysit a collapsing monarchy. Still, he listened as various advisors attempted to persuade him to support Arsinoe instead of Cleopatra, promising alliances they could not fully guarantee. Caesar found their insistence suspicious. Every path seemed to lead back to Cleopatra, yet no one wanted him to meet her. That alone piqued his interest. A missing queen in a country on the edge of unraveling was never an accident. He sensed that whatever her plans were, they would intersect with his soon enough, and probably in a dramatic fashion, knowing royal families. As evening settled across Alexandria, the palace grew quieter, yet the tension did not fade. Caesar stood at a balcony overlooking the city, the warm breeze carrying distant murmurs of unrest. Egypt felt like a kingdom holding its breath, unsure whether Caesar had arrived as its savior, its judge, or its final disruptor. and somewhere hidden from sight, Cleopatra waited for her moment to step onto the stage she had abandoned too suddenly and with too much intention. In that stillness, Caesar realized the game had already begun even before he understood the rules. Egypt was a land of shifting loyalties, silent corridors, and ambitions that did not sleep. And soon, very soon, its missing queen would return to change everything. Cleopatra approaches Caesar, a quiet entrance into destiny. Night settled over Alexandria with the softness of velvet, as if the city were slowly sinking into a dream. The torches around the palace flickered lazily, casting gentle pools of amber light that seemed more decorative than functional. Within this calm, the palace breathed in a slow, deep rhythm, unaware that a shift in its heartbeat was already on its way. For somewhere in the shadows, Cleopatra, the missing queen who haunted political conversations like a myth, was preparing her quiet re-entry into the world she intended to reclaim. Cleopatra moved through the dim corridors with the stealth of someone who had long ago learned that power is sometimes exercised most effectively in silence. Wrapped in a discreet robe and accompanied by only a few trusted hands, she navigated the palace she once called home, as if returning to a stage where her role had been abruptly interrupted. The guards outside Caesar's chamber did not expect unexpected visitors, especially not royal ones emerging from carpets or side doors or ancient hallways that supposedly no longer existed. Cleopatra, however, had always been skilled at finding entrances, even into places she had been firmly told she should not enter. Olympus. Her loyal physician guided her through a narrow passage that smelled faintly of incense and old stone. He whispered instructions in the tone of a man who loved his queen dearly, but also feared that one day her boldness might be the end of him. Cleopatra listened with calm amusement, adjusting her appearance so that when the moment arrived, she would strike the perfect balance between elegance and controlled unpredictability. She had no intention of allowing Caesar to dismiss her as a mere political refugee. She would arrive before him as a rightful monarch, as a strategist, and perhaps as something more compelling than either. When Cleopatra stepped into the room where Caesar waited, the air seemed to change slightly, as if acknowledging that two wills of considerable magnitude had finally converged. Caesar regarded her with the composed curiosity of a man accustomed to meeting rulers, generals, philosophers, and the occasional assassin, but Cleopatra was none of those things entirely. She carried an aura of deliberate confidence, the kind that made observers feel they were witnessing history, even if all she did was adjust a bracelet on her wrist. Cleopatra introduced herself not as a fugitive nor as a supplicant, but as the Queen of Egypt who had been crowned by her father before his death. Her voice flowed with the steadiness of someone presenting facts rather than making requests. She explained that her brother's regent had manipulated the young king, poisoned the royal household with suspicion, and pushed her out of Alexandria, not because she lacked legitimacy, but because she threatened their control. Caesar listened with an expression that gave away nothing and everything at the same time. He did not interrupt. He simply observed the woman whom everyone else seemed so desperate for him not to meet. She spoke of Egypt's instability, describing the rising unrest among the people, the desperation caused by dwindling grain stores, and the dangerous loyalties forming within the army. Caesar had heard similar reports from his officers, yet hearing the situation laid out by the woman who intended to fix it added a new dimension to the puzzle. Cleopatra did not ask him for charity. She offered partnership and mutual benefit, delivered with the subtle suggestion that refusing her would be far more troublesome than agreeing. There was humor, too, in her tone, a gentle, clever sharpness that Caesar could not ignore. When she mentioned the royal treasury's unfortunate emptiness, she gave a faint smile, as if apologizing on behalf of history for being inconvenient. When she referenced her brother's immaturity, she lifted an eyebrow lightly, as though inviting Caesar to understand that 12-year-olds were better suited to schoolrooms than thrones. Caesar found her approach refreshing. Most rulers begged or demanded or threatened. Cleopatra simply explained and trusted that her logic would align with his interests. As she continued, Caesar began evaluating her more thoroughly. He studied the clarity of her reasoning, the directness of her statements, and the intelligence behind her eyes. He had expected desperation, perhaps even dramatics, but Cleopatra was composed, thoughtful, and not afraid to meet his gaze. Her presence had the curious effect of softening the moment while sharpening its significance. It was like listening to a lullaby that contained the blueprints of an empire. Cleopatra stood not as someone pleading for restoration, but as someone outlining the future she intended to build. She emphasized that she was her father's chosen successor, and that Egypt's stability depended on her return to power. She positioned herself as the key to cooperation between Egypt and Rome, which was clever because Caesar preferred allies who could think beyond immediate survival. This queen had ambition, wrapped in grace, and ambition was a language Caesar understood fluently. Still, Cleopatra knew that legitimacy alone would not sway Caesar, so she added a final touch delivered with a quiet confidence that bordered on humorous. She remarked that while she admired the decor of her brother's courts, they were clearly missing the organizational finesse that she herself could provide. The implication floated softly between them. Egypt with her was an empire waiting to flourish. Egypt without her was a child's sandcastle waiting for the tide. Caesar found himself weighing her words and her presence more seriously than he had intended. As she stood before him, she seemed less like a displaced queen and more like a subtle force capable of redirecting a kingdom's course. She was young, yet carried herself as someone older than her years. She was calm, yet her resolve was unmistakable, and although she had approached him quietly, nothing about her entrance felt small. For a brief moment, the room grew still. Outside, the city exhaled into the night. Inside the chamber, two minds appraised one another in the soft glow of lamplight. Cleopatra waited without impatience. Caesar considered without haste. The kingdom outside remained unsteady, but within that room a balance was beginning to form. Caesar finally spoke, acknowledging that he now understood the situation far more clearly. Cleopatra inclined her head gently, accepting his response with the poise of a queen who expected nothing less. And while neither of them said it aloud, a quiet understanding began threading itself between them. It was the beginning of a partnership shaped not by force but by intellect, by timing, and by the subtle tug of destiny. As Cleopatra withdrew from the room, her steps light against the stone floor, Caesar watched her go with a calm expression that masked a flicker of curiosity. Egypt was changing, and he now realized that its future would likely depend on the woman who had just slipped so elegantly into his presence. And in the serene hum of Alexandria's sleeping hours, the game between them began its first gentle turn. The terms of power, a crown, redrawn in quiet shadows. Morning drifted over Alexandria with the gentle glow of a lantern rising behind silk curtains. The palace stirred slowly, as if reluctant to face the complications the new day carried. Yet within its stone walls, Caesar had already begun assembling the pieces of Egypt's puzzle in his mind. The night's encounter with Cleopatra lingered in his thoughts like a soft melody that refused to fade. She had arrived quietly, but her presence now echoed through every decision he contemplated. The time had come to redefine the order of Egypt, and Caesar approached the task with the calm certainty of someone used to rearranging kingdoms before breakfast. Cleopatra was summoned to a discreet chamber where the light fell in a golden ribbon across the floor. Caesar greeted her with the composed warmth of a man who had made up his mind, yet still enjoyed the formality of conversation. Ptolemy arrived as well, marching in with an air of youthful indignation that suggested he had practiced looking authoritative in the mirror, but had not yet mastered the technique. Behind him stood Arsinoe, whose expression conveyed the subtle impatience of someone who considered herself far more capable than her official role allowed. Caesar began by outlining the need for order. He explained that Rome required stability in Egypt, not because Rome enjoyed interfering in royal affairs, though it often did, but because chaos tended to complicate trade routes, grain shipments, and the general mood of senators who disliked surprises. Egypt, he continued, was too important to be left to sibling disputes that spilled into the streets and frightened the accountants. Ptolemy attempted to insist that he alone was the rightful king. Cleopatra replied with calm clarity that she had been chosen by their father long before any regent began whispering into the boy's ear. Arsinoe interjected as well, though her comments seemed to be directed at neither Caesar nor Cleopatra, but rather at fate itself, which she felt had unfairly overlooked her. The room hummed with arguments overlapping one another like fluttering birds trying to escape through the same narrow window. Caesar listened without irritation. He had expected this. Royal families rarely made decisions quietly, especially when crowns were involved. When the voices finally settled, he announced his ruling with a gentle firmness that left no space for debate. Cleopatra and Ptolemy, he declared, would rule together as co-monarchs, their shared throne symbolizing unity and stability. Arsinoe would hold a place of honor, but not of immediate authority, which she accepted with the stiff expression of someone filing away grievances for later use. The announcement produced a moment of stillness followed by a collective exhale. Cleopatra bowed her head slightly in acknowledgement, her acceptance carrying a quiet grace. Ptolemy attempted to protest, but Caesar's calm gaze settled upon him with such steady weight that the boy reconsidered his words and instead allowed his crown to tilt a little in agreement. Caesar elaborated that ancient Egyptian tradition permitted siblings to share the throne, a fact he found convenient enough to emphasize even if the practice was not universally admired by Rome. Once the arrangement was declared, Caesar initiated preparations for a formal ceremony. Advisors hurried through corridors, Servants carried robes embroidered with symbols of old dynasties, and the palace buzzed with the energy of a beehive suddenly awakened. Cleopatra moved through it all with composed purpose, offering short instructions to those who assisted her. She had waited for this moment, not with desperation, but with strategic patience. And now she embraced it with the controlled strength of someone who understood exactly what the crown represented. Deep within the palace council room, Caesar met privately with his commanders. Reports indicated rising tension outside the capital. Some of Ptolemy's advisors resented Cleopatra's return to power. Others feared Rome's growing influence. Caesar studied the map before him, tracing his finger along the river, as if reading the future in the shape of the Nile. The kingdom was delicate, and one wrong move could unravel everything. Yet he felt confident. Cleopatra possessed an instinct for rule that impressed him, perhaps more than he wished to admit. Later that evening, the formal proclamation took place. Musicians played a slow ceremonial tune that drifted through the hall with a dreamlike softness. Citizens gathered in the courtyard, their murmurs rising like gentle waves. Caesar stood before them with the posture of a man unbothered by the weight of history on his shoulders. He introduced Cleopatra and Ptolemy as joint rulers of Egypt, presenting the arrangement as both traditional and necessary, which was partially true and entirely effective. Cleopatra stepped forward with natural poise. She greeted her people with a serene confidence that suggested she had never been absent from their kingdom at all. Ptolemy tried to match her bearing, but ended up standing slightly behind her, where he looked less authoritative than he intended. Caesar observed the pair carefully. Though they would share the throne, the true strength of Egypt now rested with Cleopatra. After the ceremony, Cleopatra and Caesar met again, this time in a quieter setting. The sounds of celebration echoed faintly through the halls, like distant bells swaying in the wind. Cleopatra thanked Caesar not with grand speeches, but with the sincerity of someone who understood the gravity of alliance. Caesar nodded, remarking that Egypt must now focus on restoring its economy, calming its army, and ensuring that no further unrest threatened the crown. Cleopatra agreed and outlined her intentions for reform. She would stabilize grain distribution, strengthen relations with local governors, and dismantle the network of officials who had manipulated her brother during her absence. Caesar listened with approving interest. There was a precision in her plans that impressed him. She did not seek vengeance for its own sake, but rather order, something Rome valued deeply. As their conversation deepened, a hint of humor slipped into Cleopatra's tone. She pointed out that reconciling with her brother would require patience, mostly because children tended to hold grudges with great enthusiasm. Caesar allowed himself a soft laugh, the sound surprising in its warmth. Their exchange carried the gentle cadence of two minds, discovering unexpected harmony. Outside, the city glowed under moonlight. A new era had begun, though the palace itself remained uncertain of what exactly that meant. Servants celebrated quietly. Advisors whispered about the shift in power. The army waited for new orders, and Cleopatra stood beside Caesar not as a lost heir, returned to claim her place, but as a queen, stepping deliberately into the future she intended to build. When the night faded into early dawn, Caesar walked the balcony overlooking Alexandria. The city slept in peaceful shapes. He felt the subtle weight of his decision, yet he sensed it had been the right one. Egypt needed stability, and Cleopatra offered that with her calm intelligence and her unwavering sense of purpose. Cleopatra, meanwhile, stood in her restored chambers, listening to the quiet around her. She inhaled the familiar scent of oils, incense, and stone. This was her home reclaimed not through force, but through strategy. And though the journey ahead promised challenges, she felt an unshaken confidence. She had returned to her throne not as a guest, but as a ruler, ready to steady her kingdom. Thus, the new order of Egypt settled like soft sand over stone, shaping itself beneath the combined influence of a Roman general and a queen who had slipped back into power with the grace of someone who had never truly been gone. And though neither spoke it openly, they both knew that the real test of their alliance had only just begun. When war walks the streets, the quiet storm over Alexandria. Night surrendered gently to the pale morning light as Alexandria awoke with the fragile optimism of a city hoping peace had finally returned. Yet beneath the calm surface, a soft tremor of unrest tingled through the air. Rumors spread like drifting sand grains, slipping into every corner of the marketplace and every doorway of the palace. Something was brewing beyond the horizon, and even the gulls circling above the harbor seemed to sense that the day would not pass quietly. Caesar was reviewing maps in a room filled with dust motes dancing lazily through sunlight when a messenger hurried in with a breathless urgency that instantly pushed the serenity aside. Ptolemy and Arsinoe had fled the city under cover of night and had reached the royal army stationed at Pelusium. It did not take a strategist of Caesar's caliber to understand the meaning behind such a move. War, not whispers, was now going to decide Egypt's future. The report settled in the room like a slow-falling curtain. Caesar set down the scroll he had been reading and allowed the gravity of the situation to seep into the quiet. A rebellion was forming, an army was assembling, and Caesar, who had hoped for a diplomatic reshaping of Egypt, now saw lines of battle taking shape instead. Cleopatra arrived just moments later, her steps quick, but her expression calm. She listened as Caesar explained what had happened, and the tension around her eyes only tightened slightly. She had known her siblings well enough to predict that harmony would not last, particularly when the throne involved. But the timing was inconvenient, and the threat substantial. The army at Pelusium outnumbered Caesar's forces 5-1, and they were motivated. Motivated armies were always troublesome, especially when led by people who believed destiny favored them. Caesar, however, remained composed. He had faced worse odds before, and he had developed a habit of turning impossible situations into personal achievements. Preparations began immediately. Officers moved with sharp purpose, gathering weapons and repositioning patrols. In the harbor, Roman ships braced themselves for potential blockade. Cleopatra oversaw the palace defenses with a calm authority that impressed even Caesar's veterans. Though the danger was real, she approached it as if orchestrating an elaborate performance. Caesar gathered his commanders and mapped out the strategy. "We hold Alexandria," he said simply, tracing a gentle finger along the city walls, as if soothing a restless child. "If they force their way into the streets, we let them. And when they believe they have won, we strike where the city narrows and their numbers mean nothing." His plan flowed like quiet water finding its path. Cleopatra stood beside him, following every word with sharp attention. Their joint presence radiated a sense of composed confidence. Even the officers seemed steadier when she stepped near. The first tremors of conflict arrived at dusk when scouts reported that the rebel forces were marching toward Alexandria. Their footsteps shook the desert, their banners fluttered like restless flames, and as night wrapped around the city again, Alexandria inhaled deeply, preparing to face a storm it had hoped to avoid. The battle began not with a roar, but with the soft thudding of distant drums. Roman soldiers positioned themselves in narrow streets, shielded by stone walls, towering on each side. Torches flickered against columns and rooftops as archers prepared their bows. The tension was quiet, like the stillness before a drop of rain announces a storm. Then came the crash. Rebel forces swept through the wider streets with the force of a tide hitting a rocky shore. Their numbers surged, pressing forward in chaotic unity. Yet as Caesar had predicted, their advantage dissolved once they were funneled into Alexandria's labyrinth of alleys. Shouts echoed between buildings, shields clashed, spears rattled. Horses neighed as their riders struggled to maneuver in the tight passages. Caesar moved among his troops with practiced calm, encouraging precision instead of panic. Cleopatra watched from the palace balcony, her gaze steady despite the distant fires reflecting in her eyes. She understood the weight of this moment. The outcome of this battle would determine not only her reign, but her country's soul. Word reached Caesar that rebel units had reached the palace gate. He ordered a controlled retreat, drawing them forward until they believed they had ruptured Roman lines. And then, when the enemy surged confidently into the palace square, Caesar gave the signal. Roman troops emerged from hidden positions like shadows, solidifying into men surrounding the rebels from all sides. The clash that followed was intense, but Caesar's strategy worked like a quiet blade. The rebels, unable to maneuver, fell into disarray. Step by step, the Roman forces pressed forward until the palace square was theirs again. The battle stretched deep into the night, illuminated by flames licking at the edges of rooftops. One such fire burned dangerously close to the great library. Cleopatra, seeing the orange glow rising over the city, attempted to rush toward it, but was restrained by her guards, who reminded her gently that queens were not meant to sprint into burning buildings, no matter how noble the intention. Eventually, victory seeped across Alexandria like dawn breaking through fog. The rebels scattered and their leaders vanished into the dark. Caesar took stock of the losses. 700 Roman men had fallen, a number he accepted with a heavy yet controlled breath. But Alexandria still stood. The palace still stood, and Cleopatra still stood beside him. The city exhaled once the fighting ceased, though the smoke lingered. Caesar returned to his quarters exhausted, yet satisfied. Cleopatra arrived moments later to ensure he was unharmed, and the brief, soft silence that passed between them felt strangely comforting amid the chaos. She praised his strategy with quiet sincerity. He acknowledged her composure with equal respect. Outside, the night was calm again, though it carried the faint scent of ashes. Inside the palace, an uneasy peace settled. The war was not finished, but the city had survived. Cleopatra knew her siblings would not relent easily. Caesar knew reinforcements would take time. Yet in the flickering lamplight of that quiet hour, the alliance between them felt stronger than any army gathering in the sands beyond. Thus, Alexandria ended a day drenched in conflict, wrapped itself in night, and waited for the next turn of fate. And though the storm had not fully passed, the queen and the Roman general stood together ready to face the dawn. The crown secured, quiet victories, and a kingdom reborn. Dawn crept slowly over Alexandria after the long night of battle, its soft light brushing over the rooftops as if trying to soothe the scars left behind. The city felt heavy but alive, like a tired warrior who had survived the worst and now rested with quiet relief. Smoke lingered in the air, drifting gently above the streets, yet beneath it lay a fragile calm. Alexandria had endured. And now the question echoing through its stone corridors was simple. What comes next? Caesar awoke before the sun fully claimed the sky, reviewing reports delivered by exhausted messengers whose sandals looked ready to retire from military service altogether. The enemy had scattered across the desert. Skirmishes continued beyond the city's borders, but their momentum had collapsed. And most importantly, the rebel command structure had fractured in the night. Somewhere beyond the dunes, Arsinoe and Ptolemy were running out of sand to hide behind. Cleopatra entered the council chamber quietly, her expression composed, though her eyes revealed a deep concern for her people. The night's flames had taken part of the great library, and though half of its scrolls remained safe, the loss weighed on her spirit. Caesar noticed immediately but chose not to speak of it yet. Instead, he gestured for her to join him as he outlined the next phase of strategy. Their conversation unfolded with calm precision. Caesar explained that without strong leadership, the rebel army would eventually dissolve, but a symbolic action was required to accelerate the collapse. Cleopatra listened, hands folded, her presence a portrait of controlled determination. She understood the language of power and recognized that victory was not complete until her enemies understood it too. As the sun climbed, news arrived that rebel generals were willing to negotiate, an encouraging sign, though Cleopatra suspected the speed of their offer had less to do with diplomacy and more to do with fear of Caesar's tactical creativity. Caesar suggested sending a message that would carry unmistakable authority. Cleopatra agreed with the kind of faintly amused nod that implied she already knew what form that message should take. When the severed head of the treacherous minister was delivered to the opposing camp, escorted with proper ceremonial dignity by Roman soldiers, the negotiations progressed very quickly. The generals understood the implication. Continued rebellion would end, not with triumph, but with similar packaging. Caesar did not enjoy such theatrics, but acknowledged their efficiency. Cleopatra, on the other hand, did not flinch. She had grown up in a palace where power often spoke in silence, and sometimes in unmistakably clear gestures. Word soon spread that Ptolemy, attempting to flee across the Nile, had drowned in the chaos of retreat. It was an abrupt end, neither glorious nor tragic, simply swift, like a last ripple fading on the river's surface. Cleopatra received the news with a stillness that carried neither celebration nor grief. The path to her throne was now unobstructed, but the weight of leadership pressed more firmly upon her shoulders. With Ptolemy gone, Arsinoe became the final remaining symbol of resistance. Captured during her frantic escape, she was brought to Alexandria under close guard. Her arrival sparked quiet whispers throughout the palace. Some expected Cleopatra to enact immediate justice. Others expected Caesar to take control of the matter. But when Cleopatra entered the holding chamber, She simply regarded her sister with a cool, unreadable calm. Arsinoe, once fierce in her defiance, now appeared small beneath the shadow of her own ambition. The confrontation was not loud, it was not dramatic. In the stillness, Cleopatra asked her what she had hoped to gain. Arsinoe answered with accusations, jealousy, and tangled remnants of long-simmering rivalry, but Cleopatra remained unmoving. The encounter ended not with vengeance, but with a decision. Arsinoe would live, but far from Egypt, where her influence could no longer stir rebellion. After addressing the immediate threats, Cleopatra returned to the tasks that mattered most, restoring her country. Grain stores were inspected, markets reopened, the streets were cleared of debris from the battle, and little by little the city regained its rhythm. People returned to their daily routines with cautious optimism, grateful for the calm, even if uncertain of how long it would last. Caesar joined Cleopatra on the palace balcony that evening as the sun dipped beneath the horizon. The sky glowed with a quiet warmth, painting the world in soft gold. Below them, Alexandria exhaled, its heartbeat steady again. Caesar spoke of the victory with a tone both proud and weary. Cleopatra listened, her gaze following the river's winding path into the distance. She thanked him for standing beside her, for giving her kingdom the chance to reclaim its stability. Caesar responded that her strength had carried the greater burden. She had shown the fortitude of a ruler, not merely through command, but through clarity of purpose. He acknowledged that he had come to Egypt expecting a political nuisance, but instead found a queen whose resolve rivaled any leader Rome had ever produced. They stood in companionable silence for a long moment. The air was warm, the city lights blinked far below like sleepy stars settling into place. Cleopatra felt her country returning to her piece by piece. Caesar felt the weight of their alliance deepening with each passing day. Beyond the desert, the remnants of rebellion faded like echoes in the sand. Within the palace, the future began to take shape, guided by a queen determined to rebuild and a Roman general who recognized her potential. Egypt had survived the storm. Now it would begin to grow again. And under the soft blanket of evening, as Alexandria settled into the gentle hum of night, Cleopatra allowed herself one quiet breath of relief. The crown was secure, the kingdom stood steady, and her path forward, at least for now, seemed clear. A queen and a general, the soft weaving of an alliance. Night returned to Alexandria with a quiet softness, as if the city wished to wrap itself gently around the new peace settling in its streets. The palace glowed with warm lamplight, steady and calm, no longer flickering with the restless shadows of battle, and in the stillness that followed victory, Cleopatra found herself stepping into a new rhythm of rule, one that paired her steady determination with the unmistakable presence of the Roman general who had helped secure her crown. Caesar, though weary from days of strategy and nights without rest, walked through the palace halls with the composure of someone accustomed to carrying the weight of multiple nations on his shoulders. His soldiers admired his strength, his officers respected his discipline, and Cleopatra, observing him with the keen eyes of a ruler who understood power, recognized something else as well, a mind that could meet her own with equal sharpness. The first sign of their new dynamic appeared when Cleopatra called a meeting regarding the restoration of Egypt's cities. Caesar arrived expecting to guide the discussion, only to find that Cleopatra had already organized detailed reports, prepared restructure plans, and collected data on grain supplies that even his most meticulous quartermasters might envy. She presented her ideas with calm precision, occasionally adding a subtle remark that made Caesar lift an eyebrow in faint amusement. It was clear she did not intend to rule as a figurehead. She intended to rule. Caesar appreciated that more than he admitted aloud. Over the following days, the palace settled into a gentle but purposeful rhythm. Cleopatra rose early to meet with administrators and address the needs of her people. The famine had not fully passed, and the markets required careful oversight to ensure fairness and stability. Caesar, meanwhile, inspected the remaining troops, assessing what reinforcements would be needed to maintain order while still preparing for his own ambitions beyond Egypt. Sometimes their paths intersected in corridors or quiet courtyards, where sunlight filtered through lattice windows and birds perched on carved stone. Their conversations flowed easily, blending political strategy with moments of soft humor. Cleopatra possessed a wry wit that caught Caesar off guard at times, while Caesar had a calm straightforwardness that she found oddly grounding. One afternoon, Cleopatra guided Caesar through the palace gardens, lush, fragrant, and reawakened after weeks of turmoil. The lotus flowers floated serenely on still pools of water. The date palms swayed in the gentle wind as though they too had finally exhaled. She spoke of her father's love for these gardens and how he had believed that beauty could anchor a kingdom in turbulent times. Caesar listened quietly, tracing the thought with his mind and filing it alongside the many lessons he had learned in his conquests. "You have your father's clarity," Caesar said at last, in a tone neither formal nor flattering, simply observant. Cleopatra smiled, the corner of her lips curving with a softness that belied her strength. "Clarity is necessary," she replied, "especially when the world expects you to fail." It was a simple statement, yet Caesar felt its weight. He respected it, perhaps more than he should have. As days passed, the partnership between Rome and Egypt began to take on a new form, one shaped not just by necessity but by mutual understanding. Caesar provided military support, ensuring that no remaining factions within the army could threaten Cleopatra's rule. Cleopatra in turn stabilized the region's economy, reopened trade routes, and soothed the anxieties of governors who feared that Rome's involvement meant permanent occupation. She was careful, deliberate, but never submissive. Caesar found himself adjusting to her pace, matching his decisions to her insight with surprising ease. His officers noticed this shift, but kept their observations wisely to themselves. Around this time, Cleopatra announced a formal royal procession to reassure the people of Alexandria that peace had truly been restored. The city prepared eagerly. Banners were hung from balconies. Musicians tuned their instruments in the square. Even the merchants cleaned their stalls, as if expecting a surprise inspection from the queen herself. When the procession began, Cleopatra appeared radiant in gold and white, her posture steady and assured. Caesar rode beside her, though slightly behind as custom dictated. The crowds erupted in cheers. They had seen war, they had seen fear. Now they saw their queen return to them with strength and a renewed sense of purpose. At the palace afterwards, Caesar commented that the people loved her deeply. Cleopatra replied with a soft laugh that people always loved a ruler more on the day after victory than on the day before a tax collection. Caesar almost smiled, a rare accomplishment indeed. As the celebrations faded, Cleopatra and Caesar found themselves sharing increasingly frequent discussions about the future. Cleopatra spoke of restoring Egypt's former glory and building new alliances that extended far beyond the Nile. Caesar spoke of pacifying Rome's enemies, strengthening the Republic, and shaping a legacy that would outshine even the greatest Roman leaders before him. Their ambitions intertwined like vines on the same trellis, separate yet moving toward the same sky. One night, as they stood on a balcony overlooking the harbor, the air hummed with the sound of distant waves. Cleopatra asked if Caesar believed his victories would be enough to secure lasting peace for Rome. Caesar answered with unusual honesty that peace was an illusion, a moment between storms, but a necessary illusion worth pursuing regardless. Cleopatra nodded thoughtfully. "Then perhaps," she said, "our storms will need to learn to move together." It was a quiet statement delivered softly, but it carried the spark of something larger, an understanding that their futures might become more entwined than either had expected. Over the following weeks, their alliance deepened further. Cleopatra introduced Caesar to her scholars, her engineers, her astronomers, all eager to share their discoveries with the man who had crossed an empire to stand in their halls. Caesar in turn shared his military insights, offering Cleopatra a new understanding of defense and political leverage on a global scale. One evening, Cleopatra arranged a private demonstration of Egypt's engineering marvels for Caesar. The palace artisans presented intricate devices powered by water weights and pulleys, each designed with clever elegance. Caesar examined them with genuine interest, asking questions that revealed his sharp curiosity. Cleopatra watched him with quiet satisfaction, as if she had offered him a piece of her kingdom's soul. Still, beneath the soft warmth of cooperation, something unspoken lingered. Cleopatra knew Caesar would not remain in Egypt forever. His ambitions stretched across continents. Rome required him. But she also knew that while he was here, Egypt grew stronger, more stable, more resilient. Caesar, too, understood the transient nature of their circumstances. Yet he found himself staying longer than he had expected, drawn not only by political necessity, but by the calm clarity Cleopatra exuded, the kind that even the most powerful generals rarely encountered. Their conversations extended late into the night. Their strategies overlapped with ease. Their silences grew comfortable, and somewhere in the quiet hum of Alexandria's restored peace, a bond was forming, delicate yet unmistakably strong. Thus, the alliance between Cleopatra and Caesar ripened like fruit under the Egyptian sun, shaped by shared ambition, softened by mutual respect, and wrapped in the quiet intimacy of two powerful souls temporarily walking the same path. And as Egypt found its balance again, the queen and the general began to sense that the future ahead of them, no matter how uncertain, would forever carry the imprint of this gentle turning point. Part 7. The Birth of Caesarion, a Quiet Dawn for Egypt. Morning sunlight filtered through the lattice windows of the palace like soft threads of gold weaving themselves across Cleopatra's chambers. Egypt had begun to settle into its new rhythm, a peaceful one shaped by restored markets, reopened granaries, and a queen who walked through her city with the calm assurance of someone finally recognized by fate. Yet even as the nation breathed easier, a different kind of change stirred quietly within the palace, one far more intimate than crowns and treaties. Cleopatra had known for some time, though she kept the knowledge tucked gently in her heart like a secret flower not yet ready to bloom. Her steps grew slower, her nights grew heavier. Olympus, ever faithful, observed her with the watchfulness of a man who understood more than he was allowed to say aloud. And Cleopatra, though graceful as always, carried a new stillness in her movements, as if every gesture was part of a delicate dance between life and expectation. Caesar noticed too, though at first he asked nothing. He simply watched her with an attentiveness that drifted between concern and curiosity. When they walked together through the palace halls, his gaze settled on her slightly shorter breaths. When she reviewed reports, her hand rested unconsciously across her abdomen. And though Cleopatra met his eyes with her usual composure, he sensed that the moment would come when silence could no longer hold the truth. Egypt was changing, and Cleopatra was changing with it. One afternoon, while reviewing grain distribution plans, Cleopatra paused mid-sentence and closed her eyes, her breath catching softly. Caesar moved to her side with the instinct of a man who had spent his life in war, but now found himself confronting a different kind of urgency. Cleopatra exhaled slowly, opening her eyes with a faint smile that contained both reassurance and inevitability. "It seems," she said gently, "that Egypt prepares to welcome its future." Caesar's expression remained controlled, but the shift within him was unmistakable. Surprise flickered like a small flame behind his eyes, followed by a gravity he rarely revealed. He sat beside her, waiting not with the demand of a conqueror, but the quiet attention of a man who understood the delicate nature of this revelation. "Are you certain?" he asked softly. "Completely," Cleopatra replied, placing her hand where new life stirred beneath. "A son, I believe." Caesar released a slow breath, not in fear but in contemplation. His mind moved through possibilities, consequences, responsibilities, yet for the first time in many years, none of these thoughts arrived with the harsh edge of ambition. Instead, they floated gently, as though softened by something unexpected. And perhaps that something was Cleopatra herself. As the months passed, the palace shifted its energy around her. Servants trained in secrecy ensured that only trusted eyes knew of the queen's condition. Advisors spoke more quietly, their glances carrying silent calculations. And Cleopatra continued her daily duties with graceful resolve, refusing to allow motherhood to dim her authority. She reviewed troop reports while sipping herbal teas. Olympus brewed with gentle strictness. She met with merchants while subtly adjusting the weight of her robes. She even navigated political disputes with the same poised sharpness as always, though once or twice Caesar quietly intercepted meetings that he suspected might exhaust her. Through it all, their connection deepened. Not in loud declarations, but in soft exchanges shared between strategy and starlight. Caesar began spending more time in Cleopatra's private library, where scrolls from across the ancient world lay arranged in orderly rows. Cleopatra joined him in the evenings, sometimes discussing politics, sometimes discussing nothing at all. The stillness between them grew comfortable, like warm sand beneath bare feet. One evening, Cleopatra placed a papyrus scroll in his hands, detailing the genealogy of Egyptian pharaohs and the legacy of rulers who shaped nations with their children beside them. Caesar studied it quietly, understanding the unspoken meaning woven between the inked lines. "A child born of two worlds," Cleopatra murmured, "belongs to both." Caesar answered only with a thoughtful nod, but something in his gaze softened irrevocably. When the time finally came, Alexandria fell into a hush, as if the very walls wished to cradle the moment. Midwives hurried through the palace while torches cast warm halos of light along the corridors. Olympus directed the preparations with the calm precision of a man who felt the pulse of destiny beneath his fingertips. Cleopatra labored through the night, her breaths deep and steady, her resolve unwavering even as the pain rose like waves breaking against the shore. Outside the chamber, Caesar waited, pacing with a tension he tried in vain to mask. He had faced battles. He had crossed continents. But this, the fragile uncertainty of life emerging, held him captive in a way no army ever had. Then a sound broke the stillness. A newborn cry, small and sharp, rising like a single star, piercing the night. The midwives emerged moments later carrying swaddled life in gentle arms. Cleopatra, exhausted but radiant, welcomed Caesar with a serene smile that shimmered between triumph and tenderness. "Your son," she whispered. Caesar approached slowly, as though drawn by something sacred. When the child was placed into his arms, the world narrowed into a soft hush. The infant's eyes fluttered open dark, curious, impossibly new, and Caesar felt something shift quietly within the fortress of his heart. Strength recognized fragility. Power recognized legacy. A general recognized a father. Cleopatra watched him with a calm that concealed deep emotion. "I will name him Caesarion," she said, "for the world must know the truth of his blood." Caesar hesitated. He knew the dangers. He knew Rome's suspicion, its jealousy, its fear of divided loyalties. But as he gazed at the child sleeping gently against his chest, he felt those concerns fall away, if only for a moment. "Caesarion," he repeated softly. "Little Caesar." The name settled between them like a promise whispered beneath the stars. In the days that followed, Cleopatra introduced her son to her people from the palace balcony. The crowd erupted into joyous murmurs, their arms raised in greeting, their hope renewed. To them, this child was more than a prince. He was a symbol of rebirth, a bridge between nations, a quiet promise of Egypt's future. Cleopatra held Caesarion close, the breeze lifting his dark curls as she gazed across the city she loved. Caesar stood behind her, watching mother and child with a solemn expression that carried both pride and an unspoken ache. He knew he would not remain in Egypt forever. But in this moment, with the golden city spread before them and their son cradled in Cleopatra's arms, Caesar allowed himself the rare grace of simply being present. The queen, the general, and the child who joined their worlds. A new dawn had risen for Egypt, soft, fragile, and endlessly full of possibility. A queen in Rome, soft footsteps, in a city of stone. The journey from Egypt to Rome began beneath a sky of shimmering gold, the kind that seemed to bless the sea with a quiet glow. Cleopatra stood at the prow of her royal barge as it drifted from Alexandria's harbor, Caesarion cradled safely nearby. The waves lapped gently against the hull in a soothing rhythm, as if encouraging mother and child toward the distant land that awaited them. Rome, vast, powerful, unpredictable, was calling, and Cleopatra answered with the calm resolve of a queen who understood that influence traveled best not with armies, but with presence. Caesar had sent word asking her to come, though the invitation carried the unmistakable tone of a summons rather than a suggestion. Still, Cleopatra recognized the opportunity it represented. Egypt needed strong ties with Rome. Her son needed recognition from his father, and the world needed to see that she, Cleopatra, Queen of the Nile, could walk among Rome's leaders with grace and authority. The voyage stretched across tranquil days and cool nights. Cleopatra spent the evenings wrapped in soft linen, gazing across the water while Caesarion slept beside her. She hummed ancient lullabies, gentle notes that drifted into the sea wind. Occasionally, Olympus joined her, offering herbal blends and wise reminders about rest, which Cleopatra accepted with only mild protest. When the ship finally approached the Italian coast, the landscape rose like a colossal painting. Rolling hills, stately villas, vineyards clinging to slopes with the confidence of centuries. Cleopatra admired the view with a thoughtful smile. Egypt had the desert, the Nile, the temples carved from stone older than memory. Rome had strength built upon roads, order, and ambition. Two worlds, distinct yet strangely complementary. Caesar was not there to greet her. Instead, he sent Mark Antony, a man whose energy seemed to radiate in large, theatrical waves. He bowed deeply, perhaps more deeply than necessary, and greeted Cleopatra with open admiration. "Welcome to Rome, Your Majesty," he said with a flourish. "Caesar regrets that urgent affairs kept him away, but he awaits you eagerly." Cleopatra thanked him with polite composure, though inside she felt a small ripple of disappointment. She had imagined seeing Caesar upon arrival, if only to steady herself before entering the heart of Roman politics. Still, Antony's enthusiasm served as an adequate welcome. He escorted her to Caesar's country villa, nestled among cypress trees and overlooking fields that swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. The villa was serene, almost unexpectedly so. Birds sang in the gardens, fountains murmured softly. Rome, Cleopatra realized, could be peaceful when it wanted to be, though the peace felt more like a temporary pause before the city's great machine of ambition roared to life again. When night fell, Cleopatra lay awake in a bed larger than any she had slept in before. Caesarion rested comfortably in a smaller cradle draped with fine linens, and Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, found herself listening to unfamiliar sounds, rustling leaves, distant farm animals, the occasional Roman guard clearing his throat with impressive dedication. She would meet Caesar tomorrow, and Rome. Morning unfolded gently. Cleopatra dressed with deliberate elegance, choosing fabrics that whispered with every movement. She wanted Rome to see Egypt's refinement, not extravagance, not arrogance, but graceful confidence woven into silk. Caesar greeted her in the villa's grand hall, and though he wore the armor of a leader whose days were filled with urgent decisions, His eyes softened when he saw her. Cleopatra inclined her head, offering him both warmth and formality. Caesar approached her with the calm steadiness that Cleopatra had always admired, though she could sense something else beneath it. Fatigue, perhaps, or the strain of carrying Rome's shifting political tides. "You have traveled far," Caesar said quietly. "For Egypt," Cleopatra replied, "no distance is too great." Their conversation flowed easily as they walked through the gardens. Caesar admired Caesarion from a carefully maintained distance, as though allowing himself only moments of softness before duty reclaimed him. Cleopatra, watching him carefully, sensed the unspoken tension, the conflict between personal affection and political restraint. Later that afternoon, Caesar escorted her to Rome itself. The city unfolded like a living tapestry, colossal temples crowned with marble, bustling markets filled with vibrant chatter, and stone streets echoing with the footsteps of thousands. Rome was not beautiful in the way Egypt was. It was beautiful in the way mountains were. Immense, unapologetic, carved by ambition rather than nature. When Cleopatra entered the forum, crowds gathered instantly. Curiosity rippled through them like a breeze across wheat fields. A foreign queen rarely walked their streets, and certainly not one whose name had already sparked rumors in every corner of the empire. Some admired her, some whispered, some narrowed their eyes with suspicion. Cleopatra walked with quiet dignity, neither shrinking from their gaze nor provoking it, simply allowing herself to glide through Rome like a calm river, cutting across stone. That evening, Caesar hosted a gathering at his city residence, inviting Rome's most influential political figures. Cleopatra was greeted with a mixture of fascination and thinly veiled judgment. Roman etiquette was stiff, straightforward, and somewhat lacking in the dramatic flair Cleopatra was accustomed to. Egypt's court embraced color, fragrance, and warmth. Rome embraced rules, seriousness, and to Cleopatra's mild amusement, an astonishing number of togas. Octavius watched her with keen eyes, measuring her every move. Brutus greeted her politely but without warmth. Calpurnia, Caesar's wife, extended gracious hospitality, though Cleopatra sensed tension beneath the surface like fine silk stretched too tightly over a frame. Cleopatra navigated each interaction with serene tact. She spoke little but observed much. She allowed Rome to absorb her presence slowly, like a fragrance settling into the air. And though whispers circulated, some praising, some condemning, Cleopatra remained unfazed. The days that followed deepened the quiet tension surrounding her arrival. Caesar petitioned the Senate to honor her with diplomatic recognition. Statues were erected that hinted a little too strongly at divine association. And Cleopatra's presence caused ripples among those who feared her influence over Caesar. But within Caesar's villa, away from the prying eyes of Rome, Cleopatra found moments of peace. She read ancient scrolls beside shaded fountains. She walked through the orchard carrying Caesarion, who gazed at the world with wide, curious eyes. And sometimes, when Caesar visited in the evenings, they spoke softly of Egypt, of Rome, of the strange path life had woven between them. One night, as lamps flickered softly around them, Cleopatra asked Caesar whether Rome could ever truly accept what existed between them. Caesar sighed, looking toward the distant city lights. "Rome accepts power," he said. "Affection it tolerates. but the two combined. He paused, as if selecting the right words. Rome finds complicated. Cleopatra smiled faintly, understanding more than he had said aloud. Their worlds collided gracefully yet dangerously. But she did not fear the collision. She had always walked into storms with her head held high. As the chapter of her arrival in Rome unfolded, Cleopatra moved like moonlight across stone, soft, steady, luminous. Rome might not have known what to make of her, but it could not ignore her. And in the quiet corners of Caesar's villa, as she held Caesarion close and watched the stars above this foreign land, Cleopatra understood something deeply. Her presence here was not simply a diplomatic gesture. It was the beginning of a transformation of Rome, of Egypt, and of history itself. Whispers in marble halls, Rome's uneasy gaze. Rome, for all its grandeur and iron discipline, had always been a city of whispers. Power traveled through its streets on quiet footsteps, and ambition rode on every breath of wind between the columns of the Senate. After Cleopatra's arrival, those whispers grew louder, forming invisible threads that wound through forums, villas, and shadowed porticos. One could almost hear the city leaning closer, straining to understand the foreign queen who had stepped so gracefully into its heart. In Caesar's villa, Cleopatra lived enveloped by a strange blend of hospitality and scrutiny. Servants treated her with Roman formality, which lacked the fluid elegance of Egypt's courtiers, but carried its own charm. The villa's architecture, straight lines, sharp angles, orderly patterns, stood in stark contrast to Egypt's spiraling motifs and flowing hieroglyphs. Yet Cleopatra adapted with quiet ease. Each morning she walked through the peristyle garden, the cool marble beneath her sandals, Caesarion nestled in her arms as birds darted playfully between the columns. But Rome was not merely watching, Rome was judging. As Cleopatra moved through the city with Caesar, the stares followed her, curious, admiring, resentful, awed. Women whispered behind veils. Men leaned close to exchange opinions disguised as observations. Some murmured that she was beautiful, others remarked that she was too bold, and many wondered how deeply she had woven herself into Caesar's life. Cleopatra, accustomed to courts full of intrigue, allowed the murmurs to wash over her like river water. She understood that influence was born not from silence, but from steady presence. And so she walked Rome's streets with poise, offering gentle smiles to those who greeted her and graceful nods to those who attempted not to stare. Still she saw the concern etched in Caesar's expression when senators greeted her with overly stiff courtesy. Around them politics swirled like slow-moving mist, thick with meaning even before a word was spoken. One evening, Caesar escorted Cleopatra to a private gathering held in the home of a respected senator. The interior glowed with oil lamps suspended between marble pillars. The atmosphere hummed with soft conversation layered with restrained tension. Cleopatra understood immediately. This was not a celebration. It was an evaluation. Octavius was among the first to approach her. His eyes, sharp and calculating, flicked to Caesarion with the briefest shadow of disapproval before returning to her face. Cleopatra met his gaze without flinching. She recognized that look. It was the look of a young man measuring the threat of a future he could not fully control. Rome honors your presence, Octavius said calmly. Egypt honors the invitation, Cleopatra replied with serene politeness. Their exchange was simple, but beneath the surface, two dynasties weighed their destinies against each other. Brutus arrived next, offering formal greetings that carried a subtle distance. He asked her thoughts on philosophy, governance, astronomy, testing her intellect the way one might test the sharpness of a blade. Cleopatra answered each question with gentle wisdom, weaving references to Egyptian scholars with her own insights. Brutus listened intently, his expression unreadable beneath the glow of the lamplight. Later in the evening, Calpurnia, Caesar's wife, greeted Cleopatra with composed civility. Cleopatra sensed the woman's quiet strength, an inner steadiness born not of rivalry but of resignation. They spoke courteously, politely, yet something in the air grew delicate, like a curtain trembling in a subtle breeze. Meanwhile, Caesar observed it all with the careful neutrality of a man balancing two worlds. He admired Cleopatra's composure, her elegance, her confidence, but he also felt the tightening threads of Roman politics pulling around him. As days passed, the Senate grew restless. Caesar's reforms were bold, his power expanding, and the presence of a foreign queen nurtured growing suspicion. Rome could tolerate many things, but the idea of its greatest general being influenced by a woman who ruled another empire, this struck at the city's pride. Rumors spread that Caesar intended to declare himself king. Others whispered that Cleopatra sought to place Caesarion ahead of Rome's chosen heir. In taverns and marketplaces, her name floated on tongues, with tones ranging from fascination to accusation. One afternoon, Cleopatra walked alone through the villa's gardens while Caesar attended a Senate session. She noticed the air felt unusually still, as though the world held its breath. Servants moved briskly, glancing toward the city with nervous eyes. Even the doves on the pergola seemed quieter, their coos muted beneath an unseen tension. Olympus approached her, bowing slightly. "My queen," he murmured, "there is talk in Rome that Caesar's enemies gather strength." Cleopatra exhaled softly. "I sensed as much." "Some blame your presence," he continued carefully. "Others fear it." Cleopatra gazed across the courtyard, where Caesarion slept peacefully in a shaded cradle. "Fear," she whispered, "is born when the world changes faster than men expect." When Caesar returned that evening, his expression revealed more than he intended. Cleopatra walked beside him through the portico, waiting for him to speak. He finally did, his voice low and thoughtful. "They are uneasy," Caesar said. "Your presence unsettles them. Our son unsettles them." "He is a symbol," Cleopatra replied gently. "Symbols frighten those who fear the future." Caesar paused, studying her with a mixture of admiration and regret. "I cannot publicly acknowledge him," he said quietly. "Rome will not allow it." Cleopatra nodded. She had expected this, yet hearing the words pressed a faint ache against her heart. She remained silent for a moment, watching the torchlight flicker across Caesar's face. "Rome may deny him," she said, her voice soft but steady. "But Egypt never will." In the following days, Caesar grew increasingly preoccupied. Meetings stretched longer. His nights became restless. The Senate questioned his reforms. Allies expressed concern. Opponents watched him with sharpened interest. Rome, always a city of ambition, now felt like a city poised on a knife's edge. And Cleopatra, standing at the edge of an empire not her own, understood what was forming. Caesar's rising power had reached its peak, and peaks, she knew, were always precarious places. Still, she remained by his side. She attended gatherings with graceful restraint. She answered critics with quiet intelligence. She tended to Caesarion with tenderness while studying Rome's heartbeat with keen awareness. But beneath her composed exterior, she sensed a shadow gathering over Caesar, one that even she could not disperse. One night, as a cool breeze drifted through the villa, Cleopatra stood beside Caesar on the balcony overlooking the city lights. For a long moment they said nothing. Rome stretched before them like a sleeping beast. Beautiful, ancient, unpredictable. "Caesar," she murmured, "the city watches you with both awe and fear." Caesar gave a small, weary smile. "Rome watches everyone with fear," he replied, "especially its own." Cleopatra turned toward him, her eyes calm yet knowing. "Storms move quietly before they strike." Caesar did not answer. Instead, he placed a hand over hers, a simple gesture, but one that carried the weight of all that lingered between them. Below, the city breathed in the darkness, unaware of the history it would soon carve into stone. And Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, stood beside the man she knew was stepping ever closer to the edge of destiny, one that neither of them could escape. Cracks in the empire, the quiet breaking of hearts and crowns. The days that followed settled over Rome like a veil of soft mist, beautiful at first glance, yet carrying the cold hint of something approaching. Cleopatra sensed it in the way servants lowered their voices, in the cautious glances exchanged by senators, and in the tightening stillness that seemed to cling to Caesar whenever he returned from the forum. Rome was uneasy. Caesar was stretched thin, and Cleopatra felt the world shifting beneath their feet with the quiet inevitability of a tide changing its rhythm. One evening, Cleopatra waited in her chambers while Caesar prepared to meet with leading statesmen. She held Caesarion in her arms, rocking him gently as the infant reached for her necklace with tiny, determined fingers. His presence warmed her, softened her, yet she could not ignore the heavy silence surrounding them. It was the silence of Rome holding its breath, the silence that comes before storms. When Caesar entered the room, Cleopatra offered him a soft smile, though her eyes studied him carefully. His armor shone beneath lamplight, polished yet worn. His expression remained composed, but his shoulders carried a tension she had come to recognize. "You have many burdens tonight," she said quietly. "Rome grows restless," Caesar replied, removing his cloak and setting it aside. "They fear change. They fear I have grown too powerful. They fear the future." Cleopatra adjusted Caesarion in her arms before meeting Caesar's gaze. "Fear," she murmured, "is the cost of standing above others, and Rome has never liked looking up." Caesar allowed himself a brief smile, but the weariness remained in his eyes. He walked to her and brushed a gentle hand across Caesarion's forehead. For a moment the world softened around them. The child yawned, unaware of the political tempests swirling around his future. "Cleopatra," Caesar began slowly, "I must tell you something." Her breath caught slightly, but she nodded for him to continue. "The Senate believes I have allowed emotion to cloud judgment," he said. "Your presence here has become a symbol for them, a symbol they do not understand and therefore fear." Cleopatra held his gaze without flinching. "And what do you believe?" Caesar hesitated, not because he lacked answers, but because he held too many. "I believe in strength," he said. "I believe in vision, and I believe that you and I together have shaped something extraordinary. But Rome does not see it. Rome sees only a foreign queen in the home of its most powerful man." A soft ache tightened in Cleopatra's chest. She had expected challenges, she had expected tension, but hearing Caesar speak these truths aloud made the reality sharper. "And Caesarion," she murmured, her eyes drifting toward her son. "What do they see in him?" "A threat," Caesar admitted softly. "A child born of two empires, a possibility Rome is not ready to face." The words hung in the air like falling feathers, slow and heavy, despite their softness. Later that evening, Caesar left for the Senate while Cleopatra remained in the villa. She walked the corridors slowly, each step echoing faintly through the marble halls. Rome's architecture felt colder tonight, its structure rigid and unyielding compared to the flowing curves of the palaces she knew in Alexandria. She paused at a balcony and gazed across the city, watching tiny lantern lights flicker between stone walls. She wondered if the city could ever truly accept her, or her son, or the possibility that Egypt and Rome might stand side by side as equals. The thought drifted through her like a distant echo of hope, yet hope alone could not tame an empire. When Caesar returned late into the night, Cleopatra was still awake, seated near a dimly lit brazier. The warmth cast gentle shadows across her face. Caesar approached with exhausted steps, easing into the seat beside her. "They questioned me sharply," he said, rubbing his temples. "They fear I reach too far. They fear I dream beyond them." "Dreams," Cleopatra replied softly, "are always punished by small minds." Caesar exhaled slowly, allowing her words to settle over him like a balm. He admired her calm, her clarity, her unwavering sense of herself. Yet tonight, those qualities stirred a different kind of ache in him. He could not shield Cleopatra forever. He could not shield Caesarion. And deep inside, Caesar knew that the paths of power often forced impossible choices. Cleopatra seemed to sense this as well. She rested her hand lightly on his. "Tell me honestly," she whispered, "do you regret that we stand together?" Caesar's answer came without hesitation. "Never." She closed her eyes briefly. Relief washed through her, though it mingled with sadness. "But," Caesar added quietly, "Rome does not share my sentiment. The Senate grows restless. They fear monarchy. They fear influence from beyond our shores. And they will not accept a foreign queen at my side, no matter her brilliance." Cleopatra opened her eyes, fixing him with a gaze steady and serene. "Then let them fear," she said. "Fear changes nothing about who I am." Caesar studied her face, the regal confidence carved into every line. She was Egypt, the desert, the Nile, the quiet storm, the queen shaped by legacy rather than chance. And yet Rome wanted her gone. Rome wanted her diminished. Rome wanted Caesar to abandon the woman who challenged its order simply by existing. Later that week, Cleopatra attended a formal gathering in the Forum. It was meant to honor Caesar's victories, but beneath the speeches and applause, she detected the cold undertone of judgment. Senators whispered among themselves. Roman matrons observed her with guarded eyes. Even the musicians seemed to play, as though uncertain of their audience. Cleopatra stood tall, her presence serene. Caesar watched her from across the hall, admiration mingled with worry. He knew what the senators were thinking. He could almost hear their murmurs beneath the music. She is dangerous. She is ambitious. She is not Roman. When the celebration ended, Cleopatra returned to the villa, feeling the weight of the evening settle across her like a thin stone blanket. She soothed Caesarion to sleep and sat beside him, her fingers brushing his tiny hand. He deserves a future where he is not feared, she whispered. Caesar joined her moments later, tired from navigating yet another evening of political currents. They stood together over their sleeping son. Cleopatra rested her head lightly against Caesar's shoulder, and for a moment they shared a fragile peace. "Whatever comes," Caesar said softly, "I will protect you both." Cleopatra's eyes shimmered with quiet sadness. She knew Caesar meant every word, but she also knew that promises were fragile things in a city built on ambition. Outside Rome's streets grew restless. Inside the Senate, whispers sharpened, and a shadow began to grow beneath the marble floors of power. Cleopatra sensed it first, the silent shift, the hidden danger, the feeling that the world was preparing to break in ways neither she nor Caesar could stop. The storm had not yet arrived, but its wind had begun to rise. The final shadow when destiny closes its hand. Rome moved into early spring with a strange stillness, as though the city sensed an ending approaching but could not name its shape. The days grew brighter, yet the air carried an unmistakable heaviness. Cleopatra felt it each time she walked through the villa gardens, each time Caesar returned from the Senate with quiet tension clinging to his thoughts, each time she held Caesarion and wondered what future the world was preparing for him. Political unease sharpened into something more defined. Senators grew bolder in their disapproval, allies withdrew their warmth, old rivals resurfaced with careful precision, and Caesar, brilliant yet burdened, seemed to walk deeper into a labyrinth of expectations that tightened with every step. One evening, Cleopatra found him seated alone in a dim corridor, studying a scroll he was not really reading. She approached quietly and sat beside him, waiting until he finally looked up. His expression was worn, but gentle. "They distrust everything I do now," he said softly. "Every reform, every decree, every silence. Because they fear losing control," Cleopatra replied. "Power terrifies those who cling to it." Caesar exhaled, leaning his head briefly against the cool stone wall. Cleopatra observed him with a quiet tenderness. He had conquered continents, reshaped armies, and commanded nations. Yet here, in the dimness of his own villa, he looked almost humanly fragile. could return to Egypt, Caesar murmured, before Rome decides it knows too much. Cleopatra held his gaze. Egypt will always be mine. But what of you? Caesar smiled faintly, though it did not reach his eyes. Rome is not so easily escaped. In the days that followed, Caesar grew more determined, as if trying to outrun the shadow rising at his heels. He introduced new laws. He restructured councils. He humbled rivals through logic and force of will. His brilliance shone, but brilliance can be blinding, and some began to see him not as savior, but as threat. Cleopatra observed quietly from the edges of these events, sensing how tightly the world was coiling around him. Then came the day of the Senate meeting. The morning was crisp, unusually calm. Cleopatra stood in the villa courtyard holding Caesarion while Caesar prepared to leave. His attendants adjusted his cloak, his armor glinted beneath soft sunlight, and for a moment he looked like the man she had first met in Alexandria. Steady, invincible, blazing with purpose. When Cleopatra stepped toward him, Caesar stilled. They shared a silence that felt heavier than speech. She placed one hand on his arm, feeling the quiet tremor beneath the fabric. "Return to me," she whispered. Caesar offered a soft smile. "I always have." But Cleopatra knew the tone of finality when she heard it. Her heart tightened as she watched him walk away, disappearing through the archway into the waking city. What happened in the Senate that day swept through Rome like a sudden wind. Word arrived at the villa not through loud proclamation, but through trembling whispers. Cleopatra listened as the messenger faltered through his report. Senators rising from their seats, a circle forming, blades flashing beneath togas, Caesar collapsing beneath the weight of ambition turned sour. The world did not end with a crash. It ended with stunned silence. Cleopatra felt the air leave her lungs. The villa around her blurred. Caesarion stirred in her arms, but she hardly sensed it, her mind filled with stillness, vast and cold, as though the future had been ripped open without warning. Olympus reached her first, guiding her gently to a seat. Servants moved around her like shadows. Someone closed the doors to quiet the outside noise. But no silence could reach deep enough. Rome mourned loudly. Cleopatra mourned quietly. In the days after Caesar's death, her world became a series of careful decisions. She could not remain in Rome. She could not trust those who now governed the city. She could not risk Caesarion's life. And so with the dignity of a queen, she prepared her departure. Her final visit to Caesar's resting place unfolded beneath muted torchlight. She stood before the stone, her hands trembling only slightly. She spoke no words aloud. Everything she wished to say existed in the quiet spaces between breaths. You shaped empires. You shaped me. And though Rome tried to own you, your legacy lives where power and tenderness entwine. At dawn, Cleopatra departed the villa, shrouded in a soft cloak. Caesarion slept peacefully against her chest. Mark Antony, grief heavy in his face, ensured their safe passage to the harbor. As the ship drifted away from the Roman shore, Cleopatra remained at the stern, watching the city fade from view. Marble temples softened into distant shapes. Hills melted into muted silhouettes. Rome's skyline dimmed until it was nothing more than a memory carved into the horizon. The waves rocked the vessel gently like a cradle soothing a restless child. Cleopatra closed her eyes, letting the sea breeze brush her cheeks. Caesarion shifted in her arms with a small sigh. Egypt awaited them, a kingdom reborn, a child destined for greatness, and a queen carrying both sorrow and strength in equal measure. As the ship sailed toward the rising sun, Cleopatra whispered softly into the wind, not as a ruler, but as a woman whose heart had once found a companion in an unexpected place. Farewell, Caesar. The world will remember. And so the story moved forward, carried quietly on the tide, as Egypt prepared to write its next chapter beneath the watchful gaze of its queen.